Welcome, everyone. As we are interviewing today the editors and a number of the contributors to the new book put out by the University Professors Press, Becoming an Existential Humanistic Therapist, Narratives from the Journey. And people can find this book on our website at www.universityprofessorspress.com, or they can also look us up on Facebook. And so with us tonight, we have the editors, Louis Hoffman and Julia Falk. So welcome, Louis and Julia, and a number of the contributors as well, Myrtle Heery, Kirk Schneider, Nathaniel Granger, Mark Yang, and I'm sure others may be joining us as we go through. So, as I was going through this book, Louis and Julia, I said this book is like a travel log, not so much of places, but of time and persons that have contributed to the individual journeys of each of the contributors. And that each of these journeys depict the discovery of the self of the therapist and how they became or are becoming still humanistic existential therapists. So I just want to ask you to start off with, what did you hope to accomplish when you published this book? Just feel free to jump in.
Well, I think it's a good question. That, I think there was, when I first thought some about this book, there was a bit of selfishness in it, that it was an opportunity to share some stories and different things about people that I deeply care about as friends and colleagues. But there was a real desire to create something for students that, having taught about existential and humanistic therapy to students for over 20 years now, and so many of them wonder what's it like to be an existential humanistic therapist and what draws them to it, because it's different than other fields. It's not something that you just leave at the office so much, but it's so much more about who you are as a person and the way that you live. And so giving some snippets of that. And we also really wanted to have representations of people from different social positions that have found journeys to existential humanistic psychology. So I think those are the main things that really drew me to this book. Julia, how about you?
Well, I guess for me, it was also personal in a different way. I am not well published, in the academic world. So for me, the invitation to help edit it was really a privilege and something that I really took to heart. And I wanted to find my own voice as a writer in it. And since it was more narrative than academic, it was a great vehicle for doing that. And then as the time went on, I really enjoyed helping other people find their voice. So I just really appreciated the opportunity. And I wanted to live through it.
I get envious of people who are editors, because not only do you get to see the journeys of the contributors, but you have to go in depth to really understand what they were going through and the messages that they're trying to put forth. So just out of curiosity in general, what did you learn from the experience of reading and editing all of these stories?
Jim, before we jump into that, I also wanted to note that we had plans to turn this book around pretty quickly in the beginning. And everybody who participated said yes right before the pandemic hit. And that added a layer of challenge and experience to everybody's world, as they tried to write, that really made it a lot more difficult and a lot more time consuming. But in a way, it was such an opportunity to be kind to each other. So it brought meaning in that way too.
I really found myself feeling more connected to the people in the book was, I think, one of the biggest things I took away. And most of the people that contributed are people that I've known for many years and are good friends. We've traveled together around the world and to conferences and shared so many aspects of our lives. But there's something different in hearing their stories in this way. And that was, I think, one of the beautiful things, and the honesty, the vulnerability that was part of it. It just was really inspiring. I came out of so many of of reading through the chapters the first time, just feeling inspired, often having tears in my eyes. It was just a wonderful experience to see the depth of each of these individuals as a person, and that was wonderful.
Yeah, that was one of the beauties of using narrative. Everybody's heart was right there.
Mm-hmm.
Louis and Julia, were there any particular themes amongst all the contributors that stood out in particular to you?
How about you, Louis?
Yeah, I think of some that were even there before. That, one that stood out to me was how many of the people that were part of this, they had different encounters with their mortality, with death early in life, and at many points of life, and that was something that really stood out to me. There's often this early sense of deep questioning that I thought was really fascinating too. That everyone, it was evident there was a lot of reflective people that were drawn towards this, but also so much engagement with literature and sometimes philosophy too. But that engagement with literature and the arts, that was one of the things that stood out, and I really appreciated.
I think for me, of course, we did in our final concluding chapter, we did point to some overall themes, but the one that really stood out for me was the big tolerant heart of people. And I use that word in the best sense of it. I remember reading something about, the qualities of the mature personality, and about how genuinely mature, actualized people are just really able to hold the differences between people and value them. And I really saw that across all of the authors, and I just really appreciated that a lot. Really, really touched me. And I found it aspirational.
Did any of the stories present any surprises to you?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think now. That I know that there were some, but trying to think of any that jumped out at me right now. That I think one of the surprising things was just some of the similarities. That even though people came from such different backgrounds, that there's a lot of similarities in the path, but also just in the person. And I think what Julia talked about, that compassion, it's evident that there's a lot of compassion in the lives of these people from very early on. And so I think that those are some of the things that maybe well, they weren't big surprises. I don't know that there were big surprises for me, but they were things that I really appreciated in ways.
I was personally surprised by how much I enjoyed working with our writers for whom English was not their first language. And that was really a pleasure to sort of help them, bring their text into, APA 7th edition, really great English, and yet maintain their personal meaning. It was a big challenge, and I really enjoyed it.
As you reflect on the stories, what do these stories say to individuals who might be considering a career as an existential humanistic psychologist or therapist?
Well, I think get ready for an awesome ride is one of the things that it's it's such a unique journey. And I know I mentioned it some at the beginning, but this is so much more about developing a personhood. I love that, that title of Roger's book, A Way of Being. It's about a way of being with others that is healing. It's about a way of being with our own existence that draws us deeper to really ponder it. And I think it's hard to go into this field without pondering those deeper questions, well, at least to go into the existential humanistic. I think we see too often in psychology a lot of people who don't ponder these questions, and there's something that just is missing for me in that. Not to say that I don't mean that as a critique of everyone that's not drawn towards this approach, but to me that there's just something missing with that when you really engage deeply with those mysteries and of life. It changes you in some powerful ways, and I think that's one of the things that really see with a lot of the chapters in this book is how their engagement with these different issues really impacted them.
I think it could really point out to students or people from other pathways that wanted to get onto this path, really the importance of self-work too. In all of these stories, you could see people's journey of self-uncovering through the years, and you could get the sense that, they would not have been able to make the kind of loving connections with other people and clients that they really wanted to make if they had not been doing this work on themselves. And there's also a sense that it's a job that's never done. Self-work is ongoing, and I think a student would want to know that going into it.
Yeah, one thing as you're talking there that kind of dawned on me too, Julia, was that I think there's really a connection between that self-work, that exploring of the deeper issues, and then that other point that you brought up of this compassionate way of being, and that is so much a part of this approach too. And it seems in a lot of the stories that some of these deeper questions, while it's a lot of that intrapersonal work, at the same time it's really drawn people to communities, and the community becomes so, I think, important because it can be very lonely work too. Just as a therapist in general, it can be lonely work at times, but particularly as a therapist that's operating in an approach that's outside of the mainstream, that's often not understood by a lot of our colleagues that we see. And that draws us so much more to needing community to nurture us and to sustain us. But I think it also helps us engage with those questions on a deeper level as well.
I believe that many of our viewers today are likely to become or already are existential humanistic therapists. I hope there are a few or a number of folks that are watching this who, like myself, don't consider themselves to be existential humanistic psychologists. But I don't believe you need to be an existentialist, a humanistic psychologist, or a therapist to appreciate this book. I think that everyone can pull something out of this book, no matter what your approach or your beliefs may be.
Yeah, I would agree, and I certainly hope that's true. But yeah, I think it does hopefully add something there.
I know we have a number of contributors here, but I just want to relay a quick story of my own, Lewis.
Yeah.
As I was reading the individuals' stories, their journeys, I initially called this a travel log, but I'm going to call this a poetic journey, and for this reason. On one of those trips that I made with you to China, I was giving a rather dry presentation. It was all research based on self-deception, and Shui-Fu Wang was translating for me. And I said something and he's translating, and the audience burst into laughter. And I leaned over to one of our colleagues and I said, what I said wasn't that funny. And she said, he said the same thing you did, only he put it more poetically.
Mm.
And that got me to thinking about my next presentation, the next time we went out, about the stories of our lives. And I think what existential humanistic therapists do is they understand the poetry of a person's life. And the therapy that they do is a very poetic type of therapy.
I like that. Yeah.
So that's what I'm learning. I'm still continuing to learn. And I know that we have a number of contributors here. And Lewis, I don't know how you want to proceed with this, but
Yeah.
I'll send this back to you.
Okay. Yeah, well, we have some time for each of the contributors to talk a little bit about the chapter and or read a little section of that. And we're going to start off with Myrtle, because I know Myrtle has to leave pretty quickly here, and we want to make sure that we have a chance to hear from Myrtle. So I'll turn it over to you, Myrtle.
Thank you so much, Lewis, and thank you, Julie. Both of you have just done a marvelous, marvelous piece of work, and you have all of my respect for your work you've put into this. It's just wonderful. So I'm going to read a couple of pieces from my chapter, and I really want to thank both of you again, not only for the book, but for the opportunity to reflect on my life. I'm not a youngster. I am aging, which we all are doing, but I'm more evidently aging now. I'm 75. So I get to reflect on some of the things that have been very big and important in my life. So I'm going to read you a couple of sections of my chapter. One is meeting Martin Luther King. So you'll probably hear it in my voice. I am from Georgia. I live in California. In 1966, 54 years ago, I had the great honor to hear Martin Luther King speak at the Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. I, along with my white colleague roommate Lee, were the only white people in the audience. Our connection to get into this event was a friend of ours whose mother was a professor at the university. We had unbelievable good seats on the third row from the front. There are moments in life when you know, even as they are happening, that your life will be forever changed. This was such a moment. Dr. King looked directly at Lee and me and asked in his very strong, clear voice, "What are you doing with your life?" I thought to myself, I'm making good grades in college. Am I supposed to be doing something else? And again, he looked straight at us and asked, "What are you doing with your life?" His talk went on about the precious gift of life and using your limited time well. Then I remembered what my grandmother had told me when I was younger. Life doesn't go on forever. Dr. King talked openly about the fact he would most likely be killed and said he was willing to die for his commitment to the integration of African American people. My thoughts went to a lot deeper to his questions. What was I doing with my life? This question became my mantra for many months after that event. I started looking at endings, not beginnings. College would be over soon, and what was I going to do? A privileged life of traveling and drinking after college made no sense when I dared to contemplate my own death. Meeting Dr. King woke me up to the importance of using time with intention and commitment. 2 years later, when I heard of Dr. King's death, I wept. I marched, sat in the back of public buses, wrote letters, and protested the injustice suffered by African American people in the South. I started living from the inside out, not from the outside in. I began following a much larger guidance from inside to my living with intention and commitment. I had spent enough time in the South to know I did not belong there. I needed to find my people, my tribe. Eventually, I left the South and found my people in Northern California, where many doors opened to me. I'm going to move now to the last part of my chapter. It's called Humpty Dumpty and Time Out. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Mother Nature has given the world COVID-19 and put us in time out through required social distancing. Isolation and loneliness are rampant. In this process, we're seeing many Humpty Dumptys falling off walls with no kings or king's horses or king's men putting Humpty together again. We're seeing countless physical and financial deaths. The world is in an existential crisis with the main resource for help being ourselves. There is no need to turn to a king anywhere, but rather to ourselves to search closely the behaviors that impact the lives of others. By choosing to wear a mask, we can actually protect somebody from possible death. How amazing to know we can do this. Perhaps the broken Humpty Dumpty can be put back together by our conscious caring. Many years ago in my private practice, I saw a mother whose daughter had been murdered. What can any therapist say or do in such a tragedy? I gave her my heart full of care, compassion, and love. Yes, I say love in psychotherapy. The love I had for this woman's suffering infused her with hope. Once she asked me, "Do you have a child?" "Yes, I do." "I could feel you did by the way you looked at me with, what shall I say, love?" "Yes," I said, "it is love. I hope this never happens to you." Then I said, "If it does, I will come see you." Tears moved slowly down our cheeks as we gazed with love deep into each other's motherly eyes. I will remember this mother and how much our loving therapeutic relationship supported her in becoming more than she or I ever expected. She later started a nonprofit for children from the inner city and organized many acts of service. Humpty Dumpty did get broken, but the parts were put back together through acts of service and kindness to others. I say to present and becoming existential humanistic therapists, do not underestimate the healing power of love and compassion. And to Mother Nature, I say, I'm listening with my heart. I will come out of this sheltering to a new normal, knowing my actions remain true to the complete wellness of the earth and all beings who dwell upon it. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share these moving moments in my life.
Very lovely, Myrtle, that I found myself getting some of the tears as you were reading, particularly that last section, and thinking some of what Julia said about the compassion that it's so beautifully embodied in that.
Well, thank you all very much, and I'm so sorry that I have to go, but I do. And I appreciate all of your work, and I'm sorry I couldn't hear it all, but I'll hear it on. It's going to be recorded and everybody can hear it, correct?
Yes, we'll have it up. It'll be on both Facebook and YouTube. So yeah.
And you'll send us a link for that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm leaving.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, Kirk, I think you mentioned you might have to leave early as well. Did you want
Just
to
a
go
little
next?
early. Yeah, I'm okay. But
Okay.
thanks, thanks so much. I very much echo Myrtle's sentiments about this book. I actually have just begun immersing myself in it, and so I really look forward to further readings. But I didn't know you were a homecoming king, Lewis. It's wonderful to know. I relate in some ways, as I describe in my own chapter, these unlikely scenarios for the formation of an existential humanistic therapist. I definitely had my rounds with sports and swimming in particular, which became a metaphor for my work in this field and development in this field. But I thought I would read a little section of a time just after I went through a psychoanalysis as a young child over the death of my brother, who was about 7 years old, and I was close to 3 at the time. But it was a very powerful analysis that I believe helped me to save my life in many ways, and certainly to turn my life around and set me on a path to seeing what was formerly terrifying as at times a point of intrigue and wonder. And so I thought I'd read the section regarding when I was a small child. And let's see, I started becoming intrigued by scary movies. Again, unlikely or unexpected scenarios in the formation of our profession. So I write that these realizations emanating to a large degree from my psychoanalysis led me to look at scary movies with some degree of fascination instead of just paralyzing fright. It was soon after that I became increasingly intrigued with science fiction and horror books and films. We had a horror show host in Cleveland. That's where I was born and raised, who was very popular with the kids. He was quite an iconoclast. And it reminds me of a little a quote from Susan Sontag, who talked about the poetry of transgression, that sometimes crossing into the areas that we often block off, bring fresh insights, or even humor. His name was Goulardi. He was like a mesmerizing beatnik with a very funny beard, and all kinds of skeletons and posters of monsters and a lit up face on a dimly lit set. His Friday night thriller movies sparked my interest in sci-fi and horror. Most of it was campy, but some was very fascinating, unveiling creative and imaginative characters, storylines, and monsters. I recall, for example, being petrified by a late night horror film called The Cyclops when I was about 7 years old. That night, I was so braced by fear that I tore out of my friend's house where I watched the film and ran straight back to my house about a block away. The wind was whipping and the air was frigid as I dashed with my racing heart. The houses I passed looked downright evil, especially the one on the corner with its peeling paint and dark windows. That was a traumatizing episode for me in many ways, which is partly why I recall it so vividly. And yet I felt a thrill about the episode too. There was something of the fantastic about it, and my venture into the inky midnight air The sense of something chasing me stirred me to wonder what that quote monster might know or reveal. I had many such admixtures of fear and fascination walking up and down my street, looking at the puzzling houses, gnarled trees, and blowing leaves, particularly in the evening or when charmed by a show about the supernatural. And what comes to mind are many science fiction shows I watched, golden age of science fiction shows, The Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond, a serial about the paranormal, and the chills yet thrills they brought to my awakening consciousness about life and the world. The theme that united many of these shows was a theme that united many of the facets of my psychological healing, a realization that the alien or threat or monster that appeared to be so jeopardizing of humanity or my personal humanity was more like a messenger to an expanded consciousness. It was more like a shadowy guide unveiling a crisis that eventually might lead to a renewed understanding of life, the universe, or the unknown. And I think of one of the monsters in the Twilight Zone series at the end who faced the townspeople who were all pointing their guns at this big electric monster. And he said, "Put down your guns, go home, and contemplate the mysteries of the universe." And that was the last line of that show. I think that pretty much sums up my experience becoming an existential humanistic therapist. So thank you so much again to both of you for, I think, a really unique and important work in our field. Lewis and Julie.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kirk. That I think it's a very apt section of that. I remember when I first learned that you wrote a book on horror films. I thought, well, that's not something I would have expected. And but I did, went out and got it right away. But it, I think it's just such another beautiful example of where we find our inspirations in these unique places, often in literature.
Yeah, and liberation and the sense of awe can be the flip side of horror in some way.
Yeah.
Anyway, if we can stay with it, work with it.
Yeah. All right.
I'm excited to
Kirk.
see all the other contributors here and to plunge into their stories.
Yeah. Well, Nathaniel, I wonder if you would share next.
Thank you, Lewis. It's just good hearing the stories and reading through the book. I just want to thank you, Lewis, and thank Julie for this opportunity and for inviting me to contribute my voice and my experience to the book. I found myself being stretched in that it wasn't just a journey to becoming existential humanistic psychotherapist, but as I was writing, it was more of a journey of really becoming fully human, and up until the time I wrote this chapter, I attributed the beginning of my journey, particularly to one of my professors, Lewis Hoffman, and he didn't indoctrinate me or convert me to becoming an existentialist, but he just embodied it. He lived something, and after classes, many classes, I would look for Lewis, and and sometimes I would just go to his office just to talk and looking for a problem, trying to come up with a problem or an excuse to talk to him. I would just come up with anything just so that I can pique his mind as far as this term existential humanistic. And so I will read just a piece of my chapter. And one thing I have discovered upon writing this chapter, one thing that became very evident, and I read, it is not the road on which one sets out to travel. I didn't set out to become an existential humanistic psychotherapist. And in that road has no signs, no painted lines, no apparent lights, and for the most part, no rules. This road is not smooth with the pavement of absolutes and indisputable theorems, and instead of asphalt, you will find dirt and gravel, mud, and many hard rocks. Nevertheless, this road, though mostly unassuming, is not far from one's chosen path. In fact, it runs parallel to the road we're already on, much like the service road next to the interstate highway. We rarely notice this road, let alone choose it, but rather when the paved road with its directional signs and its painted straight lines dividing the lanes no longer serves us, as in the case of people stuck in traffic. The road to existentialism chooses us, beckoning a search for meaning in the meaningless. When considering this journey to becoming an existential psychotherapist, I have to surmise that a great deal of this decision-making process, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, was out of a desire perhaps to resist authority or to resist convention and control. And I would speculate that rebelliousness perhaps coerced me to jump off of the interstate onto the service road. And so in writing this, like I said, it initially I pretty much attributed my start to at the graduate school level. But as I wrote, my mind went back to my childhood, and I just felt as if, wow, this was happening all along, and I just didn't know it. At age 8, my parents had hung 2 psychedelic posters on the wall downstairs in our new home. These posters caused some embarrassment to this 8-year-old boy, titled Black Magic and Black Magic Woman. Black Magic was a ripped, provocative Black man with a huge afro. And the other Black Magic Woman was a beautiful, shapely woman, too, with a large afro and exposed breasts that were accentuated by the Black light in the incense perfume room that my dad had down there in the basement. And I, as a little boy, became obsessed with neither the Black Magic Man nor the Black Magic Woman, but rather another psychedelic poster that hung between the two. And at 8 years old, I would commit the words of that poster to memory. And besides the Color Me Brown coloring books my parents bought that depicted the beauty of Blackness to offset the whitewashed curriculum of the Chicago public school system, it was perhaps the first lyrical expression to elucidate my existence. And I quote, "I do my thing and you do your thing. I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine. You are you and I am I. And if by chance we find each other, it's beautiful." And it was signed Frederick S. Pearls. It wasn't until I was in graduate school, some decades later, that I realized the penman of those words. And nevertheless, the goal of understanding my existence and realizing my purpose, it just burnt with this insatiable desire. So much so that I think early on I wanted to be like God or a God or something in the realm of godness. Not to flaunt my leadership skills nor my supernatural gifts, but to make the world a better place. I wanted to be able to change life for so many others. And all of my Blackness, of which I was very much aware, the quest for self-actualization and the self to individuate, it continued, facilitated perhaps by my dad, who would come home from a long day's work, and upon entering the house, he would shout, "Say it loud," to which my brothers and I would in unison reply the lyrics of James Brown 1968 song, "I'm Black and I'm proud." And my sense of self was very much intricately woven in my sense of being Black. In a strange sense, my consciousness of Blackness was perhaps more discernible than that of even myself. It seems as if I knew I was, I had a sense of my Blackness. I had a sense of being a part of something as far as my family unit. In fact, my brothers and I, we were stair steps, and my parents dressed us identical. And so throughout my childhood, I just had this drive to individuate or to separate. And so Mama called me Nuki. That was my nickname. My dad called me Nate. My teachers called me Nathaniel. When I wasn't sure of who I was, two things I was sure of, and that was I was in America and I was Black. With that alone, an inherited drive passed down generationally to rebel against a system designed to strip me of my personage, just as my ancestors were stripped of their being, packed on ships to forever be shackled. One of the things that came up for me as I was writing this chapter, going back to my childhood, was one of my fondest memories was and safest memories was my grandma's house. And at grandma's house, I can enter into this state of flow. And within the flow of creating, one of the things I discovered very early on was that I did not have to be masculine or feminine, a boy or a girl, straight or gay. Realizing this existential freedom allowed me to embark upon a path transcendent of any of these polarizations. I most often felt this freedom only at grandma's house. At grandma's house, I always felt safe, and most of all, love. There is no fear in love, according to the Bible. Perfect love drives out all fear, because fear has to do with punishment. That's 1 John 4:18. At grandma's house, I could play, explore, create without the fear of punishment. At grandma's house, her loving me unconditionally allowed space and freedom to be. In his book, The Polarized Mind, Why Is It Killing Us and What We Can Do About It, Schneider proposes, Kirk, that polarization begins with fear, and extreme polarization begins with extreme fear. Fear is the impediment of creativity. It precludes flow. And as a child, my greatest fear was that of not being boy enough, or worse, being a sissy. But at grandma's house, I was free to be either, or better yet, neither. Born in Chicago, raised in working class, born in Chicago. This, by the way, this section of this poem was written my first year at college. I was 19 when I wrote this poem titled Me, Myself, Nuki, Nate, Nathaniel, Me, Myself, and I. And this is just a piece of that. Born in Chicago, raised in working class slum, the most I ever wanted was to find solidarity. With whom? With me, myself, and I. Myself never had the courage to dig within I. I could see my many facets. Me was afraid. Me was insecure. Some things I had to reveal. Some things I had to retain. I could see. I wanted to pretend to be blind. I could see right through me myself. Few people knew me myself. Me myself is real. I is real, but I is covered with a lid. I is in love with I, but I must fall in love with me myself. Me myself must see eye to eye. I must find solidarity with whom? With me, myself, and I. So, that's just the tip of the iceberg, but I'm very happy to have been able to dig deeper even within myself to put me on paper in the form of this chapter. And so again, Lewis and Julie, I just want to say thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Nathaniel. I think it's so fitting that you had the poem in there because that's been such, and then that theme has come up several times tonight because that's been such a, a big part of our connection over the years, and I think it's a really beautiful part of existential and humanistic that we connect in different ways with that poetic that certainly comes through there. All right, Mark, I'm wondering if you will share next.
Yeah. Thanks again, Louis and Julia, for the invitation. And I want to let you know and recognize that through the book, one of the very meaningful things is that you have created or brought this tribe, members of the tribe together, the community, and also I think through it will expand members of this tribe, and let you know that it has certainly expanded here in China. Inspired by the book, I initiated a round of interviews with some of my colleagues, existential colleagues, and then some of my students who are now faculty in our institute, related to the theme of the book, how they became existential humanistic psychologists. And through it, it has helped me to get to know each of them better, to know new things about them. And talked about surprises. For example, one of the things I found very surprising was Louis saying that he started out wanting to be a CBT therapist. Now, I just cannot imagine that. There's nothing wrong with CBT therapy, but I just can't see Louis practicing as a CBT therapist. So it's just life is just full of surprises. It's very pleasant to get to know people better. And right now, it's also particularly meaningful because this project has once again brought me back to this community. I mean, as I look at each of you, Ed, Nathaniel, Kirk, Louis, just getting to know Julia, I think of the times we were together, mostly here in China, and the wisdom that you've all shared. I have feelings of the presence that being around all of you. So that this community is really, really important. And I think this book does a wonderful job of creating that community and creating that meaning. Yeah. I thought I'd read from just a beginning part of my chapter. There's two sections. One is the first section is titled "A Plan B Psychologist." My dream was not to become a psychologist. Becoming a pilot was my first love. I'm still a plane spotter and occasionally fantasize about being in the captain's chair, soaring above the clouds. So what did I do? I enrolled in college and declared computer engineering as my major. I decided to study computer engineering because I enjoyed computers and did not have the grades to become an aeronautical engineer, the closest thing to a pilot that I could think of. Computer engineering felt like a good compromise. Most importantly, I needed security and opted for the safe choice of a career path as a computer engineer. Becoming an engineer was an acceptable choice towards my family pursuit of the Chinese American dream. My path was set and I was safely on my way. Except I was a lousy engineer. Maybe kind of like Lewis, being a CBT therapist. Though I did well in mathematics in high school and even competed in a few tournaments, I reached my limit in college. A very humbling and painful initial encounter with finitude. I was forced to admit to myself and others that I did not have the right stuff. My classmates were real engineers. They were better at engineering and mathematics. So reluctantly, I switched my major to psychology and eventually became a psychologist. For a while, psychology felt second best. I am a Plan B psychologist because Plan A did not work out. Thank God. And the next section is titled My Three Wise Men. The decision to get off the conventional and safe path was painful and filled with fear, and that was the path of being on computer engineering. One of the things I enjoyed about being a computer engineer major was that my path was well laid out. I now understand that as my escape from freedom, being in that well-laid path. All I had to do was bury myself in my studies, walk the gilded path one step at a time, and I would eventually arrive at the promised land. My engineering courses were pre-selected, and I did not have to deal with the confusion and anxiety of class selection every semester. I pity those who were not on the path and had a struggle for their interminate existence. Yes, a bit of narcissism there. I was one of the privileged few who did not have to enter the morass and fight for admission into the classes in the humanities that were often overcrowded. But due to my failure, I became one of the pitiful, lost, directionless souls. What a wonderful entry into existential psychology and existential psychology, right? My future was all of a sudden filled with uncertainty. What should I study? How could I get to the promised land now that I was not good enough to traverse that gilded path? I was curious about psychology, but I did not think it would lead me to the promised land. I was lost and troubled, so I sought counsel. The first wise man I sought out was Dr. Michael Tanner, the director of my computer engineer program. He'd been to the promised land. He worked for IBM and looked like he had the right stuff. Surely he would have good advice for me. He learned of my interest in psychology and suggested the field of artificial intelligence as it combined my interest in computers and psychology, a logical choice that made a lot of sense. If I only taken his advice back then, I'd be raking in the bucks now, given how AI is currently all the rage. But something was missing. Though still unclear as to what I wanted, at least I knew that I did not want. At least I knew what I did not want. The integration of computers with psychology felt like a compromise to me. I now know that for every yes, there coexists a multitude of no's. I now know that the process of finding what one wants involves negation, becoming clear about what one does not want. Then I went to the second wise man, who was a counselor in the Department of Psychology. Still thinking like an engineer, I was logical and systematic in conducting my due diligence. The counselor was true to his title and task, for he advised me on the courses that I needed to take in psychology if I were to change majors and graduate on time. He did his job as an academic counselor, but was unfortunately effective in persuading me away from psychology, for he failed to perceive my inner needs. Psychology felt dry and uninspiring as embodied by this representative. Desperate and directionless, I ventured into the office of Dr. Ralph Quinn, the hippie professor who taught humanistic psychology, my first college level course away from the Gilded Path. Looking back, his was sadly the only formal course in humanistic psychology that was available in both my undergraduate and graduate programs. Now that is a real travesty. Ralph, who preferred all his students to call him by his first name, was totally cool. I remember him seducing us with talk of sex by promising us to show slides of nude encounter groups during one of his classes. Sure enough, the large lecture hall was filled with over 400 students 2 days later. He turned off the lights and began showing us pictures of elephant seals battling for supremacy, throwing their considerable weight around the beaches of Santa Cruz. The lecture hall erupted in boos, but Ralph took it in stride. I was captivated by his charisma and his warmth. Where did he learn this stuff? Well, he was a graduate of Saybrook University. Thus, I ventured into his office during office hours and presented him with my life's dilemma. Ralph offered no advice or suggestions that day. What he did was care for me through listening intently to my pain and struggles. It is only now that I'm able to fully understand, appreciate, and describe to you the wisdom of his companionship, how he embodied existential humanistic psychology for me in the midst of my despair. He provided an experience that was much more meaningful than any counsel he wished to give. As you can tell, that experience has stayed with me till now. At that time, as a lost 20-year-old, I had no idea what took place, but it felt right. I remember walking out of his office in a comfortable daze, a daze that I now understand as a shift in consciousness. I think that's where I will end the story for now.
Thanks, Mark. It is, I think, similar to what you said about me with CBT, that it's hard to imagine you as an engineer. That,
Thank God, eh?
particularly, yeah. That over the years, one of the things I've really come to appreciate is you're such a wonderful storyteller, and I can't imagine. It's maybe my limitation in imagination, but I can't imagine you telling stories about engineering that are as captivating.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, Ed, you're up next here. I think you're on mute, Ed.
Okay. So nice to see you all, my old colleagues, friends, Mark, Lewis, Nathaniel, Kirk, and Julie, nice to see you. And it's very touching to hear all these sort of eloquent reveries, you know. I often feel at odds with any group I've ever been a part of. And I've always felt this about the existential humanistic community as well. And I remember Julie writing about the book up front some years back and not responding because I had a lot going on, and the thought about writing about myself or my own journey really didn't interest me. And then at some point, Julie wrote back again, and she said, "Well, we didn't hear back from you, and we assumed we sent it to the wrong email address." And I said, "No, you didn't." But I've been really ambivalent about taking this on because for me, writing anything is hard work, and but I appreciate Louis, and I know he's always been very respectful of me and my work, and so I said I would do it hesitantly, and I'm glad I did because I was happy with the piece that I wrote at the end, and in there. I speak at some point about a very close friend of mine. I sometimes think this man was the best friend I've had in life. He was an abstract artist, a very accomplished one, and he was a part of my parents' sort of group of friends. But as I got older, he and I just became extremely close, and I think I speak about that in this chapter, and I think that I often used to think, Jesus, I wish I had John's artistic capability, and it wasn't until after he passed away that I realized in some ways he had given me something, and that my approach to all things is fundamentally an aesthetic one. Certainly, that's the way I approach writing. Nietzsche says someplace that life is only justified as an aesthetic experience. He says that in The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music. That's the full title of that book. So my friend in particular, was a collage artist, and I think this is how I approach all things. It's certainly how I approach my writing. I just mix elements, and look for some kind of aesthetic integrity, and that's how I proceed. So this piece is collage-like, I suppose, as well. And I just have chosen one short section. One of the one of the literary figures, if I can make a plea, it would be for the humanities, film, music, literature. I think it's Eugene O'Neill who says, we were psychologists and good ones long before psychology was invented, and that guy knew what he was talking about and suffered for his art for sure. Kafka is one of the people I've often returned to, and I must have been thinking about him in at that moment in time, and so I quote him here and there throughout. And this particular section is called America, spelled with a K. This was his first novel. Kafka wrote 3 novels. None of them was ever completed. They're all considered modernist masterpieces of the 20th century. America, or the Man Who Disappeared. That was the title he gave to it, and the most recent translation has that title on it, America, or the Man Who Disappeared. And here's a quote from that book. He suddenly saw the Statue of Liberty, which had been there in view for some time, as though in an intenser light. The sword in her hand seemed only just to have been raised aloft, and the unchained winds blew about her form. So high, he said to himself, and quite forgetting to disembark, he found himself gradually pushed up against the railing by the massing throng of porters. Franz Kafka, America, the man who disappeared. It's interesting that he's holding a sword. You know, Kafka never left Europe, but somehow that image captures the violent underside that this country has, and perhaps all countries and all persons have as well. On September 29th, 1912, Kafka's friend Max Brod wrote in his diary, "Kafka in ecstasy, writing all night, a novel set in America." 2 days later, Brod wrote again, "Kafka in incredible ecstasy." And 2 days after this, Kafka continuing, very inspired, a chapter finished. I am happy for him. Running into Rollo May was a little like dropping bladder acid, something I also did on several occasions during that period of time. The influence and effect of my relationship with Rollo have proven to be long-lasting over the decades and years. I have encountered no one quite like him before or since, and I have met pretty much all the prominent players in this arena. There would appear to be aspects of existence that may be accessed only through human encounter and example. We are, in the end, all too human creatures, not suited for transcendence on everlasting arrangements. Remain faithful to the earth, cautions Nietzsche. My lateral move to Berkeley from the East Coast in the late 1970s was, psychologically speaking, an exodus of sorts from a land of pharaonic Egypt, of routine and convention, unwitting confinement. In Rollo, I found the exemplar and mentor I'd been seeking with varying degrees of awareness throughout my early adulthood. He spotted me on the very first night of class, squeezed between several others in a cramped alcove on the far side of his Tiburon living room. Rollo was instinctively predisposed toward those, quote, why silent ones in the corners, as he put it that evening. It was his emphatic belief, I came to understand, that turbulence, legitimate suffering were integral to the development of the effective psychotherapist, and by extension, effective personhood as well. Rollo was pervasively attentive to matters of character that adhere before and beyond literacy and technique. Indeed, I pondered his conception of technique as, quote, protection from consciousness, questioning him about these and other things in our earliest interactions. You should learn from all the theories, he told me, but leave them at the door to your office. Encounter, this is me continuing, lies beyond the foreground of theory and didactics. So maybe I'll stop just there with what James would call pure experience. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed. You know, that I really appreciated how you talked about the collage there, because that's one of the things that I've always loved about your writing, which I think is, you know, it's such poetic writing. And you know, I've often said to the students when writing, particularly when they use a lot of quotes, that, you know, it takes a lot of thought and reflection and wisdom to be able to use quotes well, particularly if you use many of them. But, you know, I've always thought with yours that they're so perfectly placed that just draw to reflect, and in this context, to reflect in a little bit of a different way, reflecting on ourselves. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I remember the very first time I published in one of the journals, I think it was JHP. And my friend lived in the city, but he would have this little cottage up on Block Island, which is a tiny little, in those days, unbuilt up, unpretentious island off of Block Island. Unlike Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket, it really does feel and look like an island. And so I brought this this journal, down to him, and I proudly showed him this piece. And if I'm not mistaken, I had actually had an image. One of his collages was in that piece. I got them to include some artwork, and he was very eager to see this. He was proud to. He looked at the journal, and he immediately started to criticize. And he said, he said, this is wrong. And he was talking about how it looked on the page. He hadn't read a word, And he said the spacing here, there should be more space. He said the type is wrong, and I said, John, this is a professional journal. They don't care about this stuff. And he said to me, no, he said, it's very important. And I think it is.
Yeah. Oh, Kirk, I see you've got a
I'm
lead
sorry.
here.
I have another meeting. It's been terrific reconnecting with all of you. And
Yeah.
I feel like we're bringing a lot of powerful and timely energy to this work and to our times.
Yeah.
So I say, carry on with full force.
Yeah. Thanks, Kirk. Thanks. And a number of people have had to leave because of other commitments here, but we can take another few minutes here. I think Nathaniel has to leave as well, so we may pretty well, I guess, wrap up here too. But we've got a couple of minutes. We just want to reflect how much I appreciated it, for sure, that some of my favorite people in the world were on this tonight, and it's just lovely to be able to hear this. We so often talk about the importance of stories, and we listen to people's stories on a daily basis. And I think it's valuable for us to also take a look at our own. Our stories are important too, and they're part of the bigger process. So I'm curious if anyone else has any reflections as we wrap up. Julia, well.
Well, I fully agree with you about the power of story. It really draws us in, and it creates connection and commonality in the way that academic writing doesn't. So it's wonderful to have this in addition to academic writing.
Mark, I think you're on mute there.
Yeah, Louis, like what you said just now, we offer in the work of listening to other stories and caring for them in that way. So I want to thank again Louis and Julia for creating this space that allows us to tell our own stories, and it's to be heard kind of in this way. So it's been reflective. It's been I felt cared for in as you created this space that allowed me to tell my story.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. It's been great to have an excuse to reconnect as well. That's one of the nice things that in this COVID world, it's easy to not do that. And one of the interesting things might just add in as we close is the cover art on this by a friend, Ed Mallory, that designed it. Can't thought the name of it was in here, but it's not. But it actually was inspired some by the time of COVID, which turns out to be an interesting connection there. But was drawn to it because of the just the image of it could be a person informing, coming towards clarity there, which is part of the process that we're always seeking in this approach. Is seeking clarity in who we are and who we're becoming, where we're going. So I appreciate all of you being part of this and appreciate having some time to spend with each of you.
So congratulations to both of you, Lee and Louis. It looks good. It's a nice book.
Thank you so much. It was such a privilege to work with you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Ed. And I certainly echo that it was such a privilege to get put this book together. It felt like a selfish book in so many ways to be able to do this. So.
Well, thank you, Louis and Julie, again. I have to jump off here. It's so good seeing you, Mark, and seeing you, Ed.
Yes.
Nathaniel.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.